Thank you very much. Unlike most AZREIA meetings, well, even tonight's meeting, you guys come here for the benefits of real estate. I'm going to be your doom and gloom for this evening, which is probably why they put me on first. Any of you guys seen Game of Thrones? Any Game of Thrones fans? There you go. All right, there's enough of you. So I always just, they always say winter is coming. Well, legal winter is coming from where we're dealing with. Legislative session is not over. So usually we wouldn't come here and do this kind of thing. Well, in April, frankly, we'd be months down the road before we do a recap. However, there's so many different things going on, both on a national level and on a state level. AZREIA wanted me to come in and give you guys an update, kind of see where we're going. And as I mentioned that, I think this is the first time I've ever done one of these updates for you where I've even mentioned the concept of what's going on a national level. Generally, landlord-tenant stuff, you just deal with the states. Because it's a states' right issue, you don't care what the federal government's doing. The federal government doesn't generally dabble. That has since changed because of the pandemic. You guys hadn't noticed, there's a lot more press covering this industry than ever before, which means what happens, I don't know if you guys ever look through the history of our entire country, the way any law ever gets happened, the way any Supreme Court decision ever happens, is people start raising their voice. Legislature starts coming out, passing bills, and eventually Supreme Court comes out and says what those bills mean, and that's what we live by. Well, since the pandemic, there's been so much attention, whether it's from the press, from people, tenant advocates, on this industry, that there's a shift on a national level that federal legislatures are starting to look at these types of issues, which, like I said, has never been done before. President Biden has made speeches on housing. I think that is the first president I've ever heard make public speeches on those issues. It's just not something that's been on the radar. So I'm going to touch real quickly on the federal and then go down to the state level as well. So with President Biden, I will tell you, by the way, some of these things you've seen in the AZREIA newsletter that I write articles on, I can tell you they've happened so frequently this year that there haven't been enough articles to keep up on what's going on. So first one, President Biden and the White House came out with a blueprint for resident rights. If you think about this again, resident rights have always been a states' right issue. You look at us compared to Oregon, compared to New York, totally different landlord-tenant landscape. So the concept on a national level to come out with this blueprints renter of rights is something we have never seen before. And the thought process is, coming out of the White House, is landlords are taking advantage of tenants, and therefore we need to nationalize some sort of base threshold of what we're dealing with. But again, it is such a states' right issue, it doesn't make any sense. But the White House came out with these 5 principles that they wanted to look at. And frankly, they're principles that everybody would agree with. But once you get to the details, that's where the problems come in. They want safe, quality, accessible, affordable housing. Well, everybody does. Clear and fair leases, education, enforcement, enhancement of renters' rights, the right to organize, which I've never seen somebody object to that, and eviction prevention, diversion, and relief. Now, personally, obviously the last one scares me the most because that's my business, but also your only remedy when a tenant is breaching their lease is to evict. There is nothing else. And you see so many stories in the news now about how evictions are horrible, how the implications are, and it's true, it has a negative impact on the resident. But they don't give the other side of that story, is you guys don't want to do evictions. That's not your business model. The best thing you can do is keep a resident in your home, paying the rent, and not calling you, right? That's the ideal tenant you've ever asked for. If they prepay a year, even better, those kind of things, right? But there's such a strong narrative about evictions and that implying that landlords want to do them that you see these types of things coming out. And so they're looking at ways of changing residents' rights. Now remember, going back to 5th grade schooling, generally it's the legislature that passes laws in our country, not the executive branch. So the president, the governor is not supposed to do these types of things. Those types of bills giving tenants rights is supposed to come out of the legislature. So when the White House comes out and says these types of things, it doesn't create law. It's literally a presidential wish list of like, hey, we'd like to see these things. But it doesn't exist. I mean, they have no power to do it whatsoever. It's no different than if you really follow politics, the president comes out with a budget. He then sends it to the legislature. It's meaningless. It's literally just a wish list because the president obviously doesn't write a budget for that purpose. So for the first time ever, the president is looking at these types of issues. And within those 5 issues, even though the president can't do anything, he then sends every executive agency out to try and enforce these. This is where you see a CFPB, you see a HUD coming down with fair housing issues. Everything else is kind of ramping up, even though they can't create new laws. So the first one was Freddie Mac came out, published a memorandum on all 50 states, the different rights that you have as a resident in the various states. Never been done before is pulling together all of that data, which again, it's not a big deal. It's free data, it's out there. But the fact that they're compiling the data and the points they're looking at give you an indication of what tenant advocates want to be done. So Freddie Mac's, they were looking at tenant screening, which is a huge issue, rent, late payments, security deposits, habitability and retaliation, pre-eviction protections, including notice of opportunity to cure, and eviction fees and right to counsel. Every one of those is some variation on the tack on the way you guys do business. Now, again, it's from Freddie Mac. They're just compiling data, but they're literally giving the tenant advocates the information to what to look at to how to change things on a state level. And you'll see as we get to the state side, these things are bleeding into how we operate here in the state. The last thing on a national level that came out recently was HUD published an open letter on junk fees. Now, again, HUD is the Housing and Urban Development, right? That enforces numerous things, but including fair housing. They came out with a memo basically saying junk fees are bad. Anybody know what a junk fee is, by the way? Does it sound good? No. Just by the fact, the nomenclature they use, just the fact they're describing it as a junk fee automatically puts our entire industry on the back of our feet, right? Because you automatically like, well, that sounds, who would want that? But junk fees, the way they're terming it, is anything that you charge above the base rent. So if you have any sort of amenity that goes into it, if you include internet, for example, and that's part of rent plus, that is what they consider a junk fee. What they would like to see is everything basically put into the rent, nothing else, and that's it. Which, frankly, for you guys, it's probably not as big of an issue. The multifamily world, that's going to be a significant issue for them. So they also want, from HUD, they want to eliminate rental application fees, except to cover actual costs. I don't know if anybody does that here, but like you have a charge for your administrative time. They want to get rid of that as well. You basically pass through and not make any money off what you're doing, your time. They want to be able to have tenants take their application, if they went from you, and then go to a different landlord and use that same application form. And so they don't have to do another background check on it. Mind-blowing stuff, because if a tenant shows up to your door saying, oh, look, I'm pre-qualified, you're going to be like, there's no way I believe what you just gave me. You want your own ability to do that, but they want to take that ability away from you guys because they're saying, oh, you guys, landlords are just gouging everybody. Not realizing there is a price to doing business. There's a cost of you guys doing that. It's not simply just sit back and make all this money, which is good, not gonna lie to you, but that's not how it works. You guys have time into it, you have the risk into it as well. All right, so think about that backdrop for a second. With the federal government, all the news media outlets, tenant advocates across the board, and I can tell you, I'm obviously well into this world. My Google feed adjusts, every person's adjust, and every eviction story across the country starts popping up on my news. Every tenant advocate, every landlord advocate, all of those stories show up on my phone when I wake up in the morning. There's so many stories on a regular basis. None of them from the landlord-tenant side, from the landlord side. We went through the eviction moratorium, and it was all about an eviction tsunami coming and how bad it was going to be for residents. And maybe 1 out of 50 stories was how bad it was for a property owner that couldn't evict somebody, but they still had to pay their mortgage. That just never gains traction, but that's the reality of the risk you guys take. Is you're in the business for this, and you're in the business to make a profit, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you're taking the risk as well, so you have to be rewarded for it. But you don't see that, and because of those narratives, that's what we start seeing down at the legislature as well. So this year, anybody knows how this works generally. Every state's slightly different. In Arizona, legislature opens up in January. Theoretically, we should close by like May. Sine die would be the end of it. The more things you can't agree on, the longer and longer it goes and the more problems it comes, ultimately with the state budget as well. So right now we're probably 3/4 of the way done, but nothing's done until the books are all signed off on. But right now, 1,630 bills have been introduced. 92 bills. So again, 5th grade legislative history. Legislature passes bills, sends it over to the governor signs them into law, right? That's kind of how we work. So 1,630 bills have been introduced. Out of them, 92 bills have made it out of the legislature and over to the governor's desk. 29 of those have been vetoed, and 22 have been signed by the governor. So we're waiting to see still what the legislature sends over, and what the governor signs. If you remember, unless you guys don't live here or you live in a bubble, we are in what's called split government right now. in the House and the Senate, there's one extra vote for Republicans. And we have a Democratic governor, which means our legislature and our governor don't like each other and do not work well together. Now, some people think that's actually how the government's supposed to work, which is kind of true. We don't like each other, we meet in the middle, and that's actually what's good for the state, which in theory is great. But when you're in the weeds and making the sausage, it's not so much fun to go through. And so we see, again, realistically, much more on a property rights. Republicans down in the legislature fall on a Republican property rights side, and Democrats do not. And that's kind of where a split is and what's going on here that we'll go through. In terms of what you're seeing, what bills are proposed, and also what the governor has rejected. For example, the main bill that has actually made it out of the legislature on our world was a proposal to get rid of rental tax. You guys, please tell me if you all rent properties, you're all aware you charge your tenant rental tax, right? That money is owed to the government. That is not yours for pocketing. Also, if you're paying it to the government and you haven't been collecting it, you have an absolute right to actually charge that to your tenant as well as a pass-through. Perfectly fine. A lot of you guys, it's weird because a lot of states don't have that tax. But if you really think about it, it's a tax against people that are just renters. Homeowners don't have to pay that tax the way that renters do because you guys all pass it through renters. So it's a progressive tax. They're just charging it theoretically to low-income people that can't afford it. So there's been a big push, which we've supported for a long time, saying, why do you not just get rid of that tax? It'll save renters. It's an easy way to save renters a couple bucks, and that's it. And so the Republican legislature actually got it out of the legislature and sent it over to the governor, and the governor vetoed it. So the question is, why would the governor veto it? Because from the cities and towns, they proposed that it cost them about $190 million in tax revenue a year. And that's where you see the conflict between what the legislature is looking to do and what the governor is looking to do, because obviously the cities need that money, but at the same time, it's a very easy tax cut to help low-income people from their perspective. So you go back and forth. But so far, this legislative session, there have been 22 anti-landlord bills proposed in Arizona. Again, we are historically a landlord-friendly property owner right state. And there's 22 anti-landlord bills that have been proposed. Now think about that again with the way I described the split of what we have. If it was a different legislative makeup that we had in the House and the Senate, those would pass out unequivocally, including things such as rent control, longer period for your notices, longer periods on your writ of restitutions. That significantly affects your ownership, your return, and what you can deal with. Think about a simple thing, which sound one of the easiest things to do. Right now we have a 5-day notice for non-payment of rent in Arizona. You give a 5-day notice, you then file your eviction. So generally, what that's actually calculated pretty well is so that if you properly invoke your rights, you can get somebody out of the property in a month to worst case scenario, 4 to 6 weeks, right? That's pretty fair. And you may not think about it, but at the same time in Arizona, we have another law that says you can charge a security deposit up to a month and a half. It's directly correlated. The thought process is if somebody doesn't pay you, you have to go through the eviction process. Your deposit will then equal and cover that amount. Brilliant writing way back in the day. But now what if they're talking about is taking a written 5-day notice period up to a 15-day notice period, that pushes your entire process back. And no matter what, you're gonna be in the second month. So you have another month of rent or your mortgage payment, if you look at it that way, that's not gonna be covered because of that. But that's what we're dealing with. So one step back here for a second. Also, and all of these, thankfully, again, these bills have not survived. These bills have all died in the legislature. I don't think probably any bill will make it out of the legislature this session. We have the city ones, which we're going to talk about in a second as well. But because we have such a contested issue between the legislature and the governor, everything's just stalling out, which in this case actually works for you guys. But what you have to be aware of is what's coming, because there's a vote again next year, and that's going to entirely swing what this state looks like in the future. That will be, 24 will be the defining moment of what the future of the state looks like. Another bill I want to propose is that you can't charge late fees without a 5-day grace period. No idea why that's the state's issue, but it is. Or this was a remarkable one. For any termination for removal from the rental market for you to move into a rental home or to sell off a rental home, the landlord will be required to waive 1 month's rent for the tenant or provide the tenant 1 month's rent to relocate. What I would call the Oregon and Washington rules, basically. You have to pay your tenant to move if you want them out of your property. Think about how crazy that is. But that's the kind of stuff that we're down at the legislature, and I'll go testify. I went to DC this year to meet with legislators to talk about how bad some of these concepts are as well. This is the stuff that you see because of the news coverage. And you have to be aware of what's going on because this is the reality we live in now. There were, I think, at least 5 rent control bills proposed this past legislative session. And I say 5, some of them in the House, some in the Senate, them all having various degrees of how much, whether it's like 5% plus CPI, 10% cap, whatever it is, all of those affecting what you can charge, how you can charge it, and then also, of course, what happens at the end of the lease as well, including payouts to people that had to move. So on a state level, short answer is nothing is likely going to change this year because of how split we are. Thankfully, it's going to kind of be the beauty of split government. Nothing gets done, which most people say that's bad. Thankfully, this time it's not a bad deal. Citywide, which is the most recent issue of what we're dealing with, of course, is source of income. And I kind of figure here we can have some questions if you guys want. I'll give you a brief political summary. How are we doing on time, by the way? A few more minutes. All right, brief political summary. Tucson, past source of income. Everybody know what source of income is? I hate when people ask that question when they're doing speeches because nobody's actually going to say, oh, I don't know. The source of income is making it discrimination under fair housing to not allow Section 8 or not take somebody based on where their income comes from. Now, they could say Section 8 really quickly and it would be much easier. But years back, people got clever and said source of income because it doesn't sound like that big of a deal. But now that includes rental assistance. They defined it as alimony, child support, almost anything where a person gets in money, you guys now have to potentially accept that as income. So Tucson passed this idea because Tucson's very progressive in pushing these types of issues. They passed it in September. A legislature, the guy that's Speaker of the House right now, Ben Toma, sent a letter to the Attorney General, says, hey, I think Tucson's preempted. I don't think Tucson can do that. At that point, Mark Brnovich, who's the Attorney General, looked at it and said, you know what? Tucson doesn't have the authority to do that. The law is, their ordinance is illegal. It must be struck. And we have a whole procedure in Arizona to get that done. So there was a vote after that. Mark Brnovich is no longer the Attorney General. Chris Mays comes in. This is where the cities got clever. Tucson doesn't change anything. They still left their law repealed. Phoenix, as the biggest city in the state, then comes in and says, you know what? We're going to do source of income as well. But we're not going to make it effective until Chris Mays now gives her opinion on Tucson's ordinance. So you have 2 of the biggest cities in the entire state set this up and then tee it back up for the new Attorney General. New Attorney General comes out, says, oh, Brnovich was wrong. Tucson can do this. It's all effective. And then Phoenix comes out and says, okay, Chris Mays made it effective in Tucson. Phoenix's source of income now is effective April 6th, which was last Thursday. So if you own rental properties in Phoenix, if you own rental properties in Tucson, and I'm talking about Tucson proper, Phoenix proper, you now have to accept Section 8, source of income, but most specifically Section 8 residents. You can no longer say, I do not participate in Section 8. If you remember nothing from this meeting at all, if you remember nothing from my newsletters, you will get sued from testers if you mess up this one question. And this is happening already. I've heard it from clients. Somebody will call you out of the blue, say, is that your house for rent? Yes, it is. Oh, I'm on Section 8. Will you rent to me? Your answer should be, yes, we rent to anybody that qualifies. Please apply. Where last week at this time, I would have told you, you can say, no, sorry, we don't participate in Section 8. You can't do that anymore. And what's so important is not just the acceptance of it. If anybody has ever been in Section 8, there's a lot more hurdles that you have to deal with. The city can come in and do inspections. They have a right to withhold rent from you. There's a little lag in them paying you in the front side. And let me be entirely clear. I am a big proponent of the Section 8 program. I'm a big supporter of Home Inc. I'm a board member for Threshold, which does private versions of the same thing, and they can actually pay landlords to do all of these things. I think the programs are great. Mandating it by the government, though, when that's not your business, is another issue. Because the problem you guys have, when you rent to a tenant and it's a Section 8 tenant, you went from you and the tenant in a contract this little line to now you have a triangle. It's you, the tenant, and the government. And if the government comes in and your guys' home, if they feel it's not up to their inspection quality, they can withhold the rent from you. Now, you guys, I assume, maintain your properties. You don't get into those situations, but it's not a great situation to be in. So, City of Phoenix, City of Tucson. City proper, which means if you're in an unincorporated area, it does not apply. If you're in the border, a lot of border cities around Phoenix have different addresses, like a Scottsdale zip code, but you're getting Phoenix city sewer, utilities, all of those kind of things. If you're questioning of what your property falls under, look at the property and figure out what they vote for. If they vote for city council, Phoenix City Council, then you're going to be bound by the Phoenix ordinance. And so you have to be clear that you, in those cases, you would accept it. Similarly, I expect Flagstaff to do this shortly, Tempe as well. Again, I'm a big fan of the program. I just think doing it that way is not great. I also think for fair housing purposes, it's very dangerous getting piecemeal approaches to things. These things should be dealt with on a statewide issue, so you don't have like Glendale have different fair housing protections than Phoenix does. And renters don't know what rights they have depending on where they're living. It just creates a bit of chaos. So not a ton of fun there, but I'm shortly out of time. So if we have a couple minutes for questions anybody has.
Section 8 close to market as far as what they'll pay?
Excellent question. So Section 8, the good news is with Section 8, with source of income becoming a protected class, so the question is Section 8 close to what the actual fair rental world looks like for what you guys are charging in rents? Close, depending. What they came out, every year HUD announces their rates. 2023, they were announced back in October. For a studio, you're looking at $1,344 a month. 1 bedroom, $1,467, 2 bedroom, $1,740, 3 bedroom, $2,386. The city also has the ability to go about 10%, sometimes in extreme cases, 20% above that, but that's kind of the default. So A-class properties, probably not gonna matter, right? It depends on what your kind of home is, what kind of area of the city it is. And to be honest with you, if for some reason you ever wanted to not participate in Section 8 at all, there's a ton of ways to avoid it. And I don't mean that as like slimy kind of thing. It's just reality is you don't have to drop your rents for Section 8. You don't have to change your income requirements or any other requirements. So if you wanted, for example, 6 times the monthly rent, somebody's not going to do that. But the way you have to do that is apply that to subsidized and non-subsidized. So if you increase your credit scores, if you increase your rents, it's fine. You're just going to minimize the amount of potential applicants that you have. Frankly, again, I think if you put in the time, you can do Section 8 well, and there's a benefit if you get the rent every month. But you have to know what you're doing and be on top of it.
Hey, Mike Del Pree, Executive Director of AZREIA, the Arizona Real Estate Investors Association, and I'd like to thank you for watching the Arizona Legislative Update by Mark Zinman of Zona Law. We hope you found this information valuable and you're eager to stay informed on these new proposed laws. To take action and make a difference, we encourage you to do the following. 1. Share this video with your network. Raise awareness about the proposed laws and their potential impact on the real estate industry here in Arizona. 2. Visit AZREIA.org to access more resources and more information on the latest legislative updates and real estate news. 3. Attend AZREIA's upcoming events, meetings to learn more about the proposed laws and network with fellow real estate professionals. 4. Most importantly, reach out to your local representatives. Share your thoughts on the proposed legislation and advocate for the interests of the real estate investing community here in Arizona. And remember, your voice and your actions can make a difference in shaping the future of the real estate business here in Arizona. Stay informed, get involved, and make your voice heard.